Hey everyone, Grayson here, and this might be the coolest thing that has happened to me on YouTube so far. A few weeks ago, I made a video fixing the Kalam cosmological argument for God's existence, and it turns out that William Lane Craig, the popularizer of the Kalam cosmological argument, who literally wrote his PhD dissertation on the subject, responded to my video. That is not, however, what I was referring to as the coolest thing that's happened to me on YouTube so far. I mean, it's really not that cool that William Lane Craig responded. What's cool is that in response to William Lane Craig's video, Joe Schmidt of the Majesty of Reason channel and Phil Halper of the Skydive Phil channel, and Daniel Linford, a PhD philosopher who literally specializes in the philosophy of physics and the cosmological argument, those three, whom I respect immensely, made a video in response to William Lane Craig's video about my video, and the three of them were coming to my defense against William Lane Craig. It was like such an honor and the coolest thing that's happened so far on YouTube for me personally. So this video is going to be my official response to Dr. Craig's video. The way that they set this up on William Lane Craig's podcast, the Reasonable Faith podcast, is that his co-host, which I assume is his employee to some extent, is the one who shows Craig the video to which he's supposedly live reacting to, but yet he has already prepared quotes to support his responses in advance. So I don't know to what degree that Craig had already seen my video before this was recorded, but the framing of the podcast is that this is the first time that he's seen it, and his co-host has clipped it up, which we will see leads to some problems down the road. But let's begin, shall we?
Bill, occasionally I look around to see if there are any recent responses to the Kalam cosmological argument. I found two on YouTube, so I have some video clips for you to check out. You may be a little disappointed, Bill. I don't think there's anything that new in these, but we'll look at them. The first set of clips is from science communicator Grayson Hawk. This video has over 2,500 views. He claims he can fix the Kalam so that it's more accurate. So let's check out his first clip.
Popularized by William Lane Craig, very, very famous Christian apologist. Covered him on the channel before. 1. All things that begin to exist have a cause. Alright, so this little cut that was inserted here is not the biggest deal in the world, because I think I understand why it was done. But still, it's going to be emblematic of the kinds of problematic territory we're going to get to with this co-host cutting up my original video. Here's the clip of the actual original video for what I said uncut. Very, very famous Christian apologist. Covered him on the channel before. Kind of a disgusting human being. Check that video out if you want to know the details for why. So yeah, I can understand why the co-host maybe cut that part out. That's in reference to the video where I was talking about William Lane Craig saying that actually the slaughter of the Canaanite infants and children and farm animals was morally correct and right for God to command. So yeah, I think that that's pretty morally horrific, and I don't think you're a good person if you support that. And that's what I was referring to there. So I understand maybe to protect him they took that out, but we're going to see that that's not the only thing that they took out, and they actually took out some very crucial parts about my argument. So I'm not going to do that to Dr. Craig. I'm going to be playing his clips uncut. I'm not going to clip in between them. I'm going to just listen to what he's actually saying in full, and I will be playing them all in order, except for this next clip. This is the only clip I'm going to be taking out of order, and it's the very, very ending clip for this entire podcast episode that I just felt we really needed to highlight up front before we get into the rest of the details of premises 1 and 2, because I think it's very important to hear what William Lane Craig says at the ending addressed to me, but we're going to just see if he's consistent with his words of advice. Let's listen.
Well, Bill, as we wrap it up, I know you'd probably like to scold these guys for not doing their due diligence. I say that because there's a lot of smirking and snickering and things like that in these videos. But maybe we can offer them some advice. I know the temptation is for them to crank out content to grow their channels, but perhaps they should devote a month or two to examining yours and others' responses to their rebuttals before they crank out a video on the topic.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea because these are not new objections. These are objections that have been multiply addressed before. But I think there's a lesson too for our listeners, Kevin, that I'd like to highlight here. And that is, do you notice that these fellows, particularly Grayson, didn't give any documentation for their opinions? They just asserted them. And if there's anything that the internet generation has learned, it is to be skeptical about things you hear or see on the internet. Anybody can get on and make assertions. And so whenever you hear people making assertions, you always need to think critically and ask, what is the documentation that he gives for that? In my responses today, I was careful to give documentation to Vilenkin's and Hawking and Penrose's statements that our viewers can check out for themselves. And so I would encourage people, when you listen to these popularizers, don't be gullible. Don't think that they're authorities on this matter. Ask for the documentation that supports their assertions before you buy into them too quickly.
All right, so one, I didn't make a doctoral thesis fixing the Kalam cosmological argument. I made a YouTube video in my room in like half an hour, okay? If there's something that I should have cited in that original video, I'm open to that criticism. But it goes both ways, Bill. So I wanted to play this up front so that we can see whether or not Dr. Craig's own arguments pass his own standards. So we'll see if, let's just say, keep that in mind when we hear Bill's response to my video. What did he say? Think critically about their documentation and whether or not it supports their arguments. I think that that's good advice. That's really good advice, and I agree with William Lane Craig about it. So let's apply his advice to his own response, shall we? 1. All things that begin to exist have a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. The conclusion, therefore the universe had a cause. Which the observant viewer may notice is actually not an argument for the existence of God. Now, there's a lot of, introduction of some more assumptions, a lot of mental gymnastics to go from the universe had a cause to that cause was a personal, all-knowing, all-loving, all-good God.
So he calls the conceptual analysis of the cause mental gymnastics, Bill.
Yes, what he does is he presents half of the argument and then says it doesn't justify the final conclusion. Well, that is, of course, because it's incomplete as he presents it. If anything, he should accuse me of oversimplifying a much more complex argument, which involves a derivation of the properties of the first cause that show that this cause must be a first, uncaused, beginningless, timeless, changeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which I think is a legitimate and sufficiently robust concept to qualify as a concept of God.
Yes, Bill, that's exactly what I was referring to accurately as mental gymnastics. The reason why I just papered over it and didn't address the rest of your arguments that get you from the universe had a cause all the way to that cause is God, the reason I just skipped over it and labeled it as mental gymnastics accurately is because it wasn't relevant to the video, because my issues are with premises 1 and 2. So if there's problems with premises 1 and 2, nothing else after that is going to matter. So I don't need to address all of your mental gymnastics for how you get from a cause to that cause being your God specifically. I don't need to address that because it wasn't the point of my video, because the point of my video was fixing the first premises 1 and 2. But alright, I apologize for my snide use of adjectives to characterize your arguments that ultimately were not the topic of the video that I was making and didn't need to be commented upon. Alright, fair enough.
Here's the next clip where he attempts to fix the first premise. Let's go to that.
What are some examples of things that have begun to exist, right? Like, we could just throw out a random example like a chair, like the chair I'm sitting on right now. You will not find a verifiable instance where you can say, yes, this is when this thing began to exist. The creation of the chair was not some ex nihilo creation out of nothing. It was just a rearrangement of previously existing parts. In fact, I would say that there are 0 examples of that, 0 verifiable examples of anything coming into existence from nothing.
I also noticed in the comments of this video, Bill, that people are saying matter is neither created nor destroyed, just transformed. The first law of thermodynamics.
So here's the first instance of a problem resulting from this co-host splicing up my video, is that he left out the core of my argument. Like, at least we didn't get to see Craig listening to that part of my argument. It's unknown whether or not he even heard that part of the argument. So I am going to let him respond to what he heard. But before we hear that response, I want to show a couple other clips that were just conveniently left on the cutting room floor for this podcast, where I try to articulate my actual argument in more detail than what was shown to Craig. You can't really point to an instance where a thing has actually come into existence ex nihilo, like is proposed by the theists, or at least the creationists. There is no known example that I know of. I mean, leave it in the comments if you think that you have an example. When we colloquially say that things come into existence, like this chair came into existence, what we actually mean by that, what is meant by the sentence, this chair came into existence, is actually, this chair was assembled from pre-existing parts. Perhaps it is a valid criticism that I should have articulated my argument better and more clearly and succinctly so that it could not be quote mined by people like this, because the way that this video right here being presented to Craig has been quote mined and taken out of context with these clips basically changes what my argument even was. Like, it sounds like I'm saying that nothing begins to exist, which is not the argument I was making. And like, lots of people in the comments for the original video seem to have gotten that message too. So perhaps it was my fault for not being articulate enough for the point I was trying to make. The point that I was making in that original video is that when we say that a thing begins to exist, this language is too ambiguous because there are multiple meanings. In literally every example I can think of, when something begins to exist, like this chair or myself, what that means is that it was assembled from pre-existing parts and not created ex nihilo, as in not created out of nothing. So if we're going to try to use our observations about things being created, like a chair or myself, we cannot extrapolate those conclusions to things being created ex nihilo from nothing, because that's a logical leap. Those are two different types of being created. My point was that 100% of everything that we know about is creation out of other things, not creation ex nihilo. So you cannot extrapolate your conclusions from this one over to this one. I don't think that I expressed that point very well in the first video, so I'm trying to remedy that here and be very, very clear about what I was trying to communicate. It's not just the first law of thermodynamics that matter is never created or destroyed. Like, if William Lane Craig wanted a citation for my argument, that one works perfectly. I mean, I didn't think that I needed to provide a citation for things are like energy is never created or destroyed, but just changes form. Like, that's literally the most consensus thing that I can even imagine in science. It's the first law of thermodynamics. But if William Lane Craig wants to get on me for not citing my sources, I can cite the first law if that'll make him happy. But he never responds to that. Like, even when the co-host here asks him point up to respond to people that bring up the first law of thermodynamics as a criticism for this first claim about creation ex nihilo, here's how he responded.
People are saying matter is neither created nor destroyed, just transformed. The first law of thermodynamics.
Well, this response involves a fundamental confusion of efficient causality and material causality. An efficient cause is that which brings the effect into being. So take the chair. The chair is brought into being by a carpenter, and so the carpenter is the efficient cause of the chair, which begins to exist. The chair also has a material cause, namely the wood and the carbon atoms of which it's made. And the fact that the chair has a material cause in no way suggests that the chair itself doesn't begin to exist. The chair is not past eternal, even if the carbon atoms that make it up pre-exist the chair. So what we're interested in is, what are the causal conditions for something that begins to exist? The fact that that things begin to exist all the time is evident, for example, from the fact that we ourselves begin to exist. I'd invite Grayson to ask himself, did he begin to exist? Does he think that he existed prior to the union of his mother's egg and his father's sperm? Does he think that he is past eternal, that he has always existed? Well, of course not. He began to exist at that moment of conception. And so the fact that things have material causes in addition to efficient causes is in no sense a refutation of the evident fact that things do begin to exist all around us all the time.
No, that's not my argument. Seriously, I mean, was anybody actually listening to that first video? Anybody?
Craig thinks that Grayson is arguing that this means that nothing actually or really begins to exist. But that's not what Grayson is arguing. And if you watch Grayson's video, that's not what Grayson ends up saying. So, Grayson is quoted here as saying a few things that make it sound as though that's what he's saying. But really, what Grayson is saying is that what it means for something to begin to exist is that it is produced from pre-existing materials.
Thank you. Thank you, PhD philosopher Daniel Linford. Somebody understood my argument in that original video. It certainly was not William Lane Craig, because I never was making the argument that things don't begin to exist. I'm trying to make the distinction between beginning to exist in the sense of 100% of all of our empirical experience as being created from pre-existing material versus beginning to exist from nothing, ex nihilo. I'm trying to differentiate them as two different phenomenon when you can't extrapolate conclusions about one to the other. That was my point. Somebody, thank you, understood. Now, I didn't know much about Dr. Linford before this video, but he's awesome. He got his PhD in philosophy from Purdue University, and it seems like his thesis was specifically about whether science tells us if the universe had a beginning or not. So incredibly relevant. We will talk more about that when William Lane Craig gets to premise 2. Believe me. Dr. Linford teaches philosophy professionally, so it really warms my heart and is a real honor that somebody was watching my video who understood the argument that I was presenting, and that means a lot. So thank you to Dr. Linford, and thank you to Joe Schmid as well from the Majesty of Reason YouTube channel. Check it out, subscribe if you haven't. It's like an amazing channel for philosophy and metaphysics. He was also paying attention to what my argument actually was. So thank you, Joe.
Grayson, he explicitly says that when I think this is almost a quote from Grayson. He said it's around the 4-minute, 30-second mark. He says, when we say that something begins to exist, we mean that it was produced by pre-existent materials. And of course, Grayson is arguing that his chair was in fact produced by pre-existing materials.
Right.
So he is saying
the
that things
point.
he is saying that things begin to exist. We have him committing himself to saying that things do in fact begin to exist. So I just want to say that for the audience.
Grayson, again, is not arguing that nothing begins to exist. Grayson would never say that he didn't begin to exist. Instead, what Grayson would say is that he began to exist in the sense that he was created from pre-existing materials. And so this entire line of argumentation that Craig has embarked upon is just a reply to a straw man. But what I think Grayson really is arguing is that either we understand the causal principle as a principle about things begin to exist in this, what Grayson takes to be an ordinary sense, which is that everything we've experienced with is produced from some pre-existing stuff, or we interpret the causal principle as having to do with creation ex nihilo, in which case the causal principle is just unjustified because we have no experience with things that begin to exist ex nihilo. So so Grayson thinks that the causal principle is either irrelevant to the conclusion or unjustified. That's the way that I think we should be understanding what Grayson is saying. Now, I don't think that we really should understand the causal principle in that way. I think that we should understand the causal principle to be the principle that everything that begins to exist has an efficient cause. And if that's the way that you understand the causal principle, we're here, by the way, begin to exist. It's just taken in the broadest sense possible. Whether it begins to exist from pre-existing materials or from nothing at all, the causal principle claims that things have efficient causes. Now, I think there's another kind of reason that you might object to that principle, which is close to what Grayson is saying. You might point out that that interpretation, that the causal principle under that interpretation is no more well justified than another principle that I'll call the material causal principle, according to which everything that begins to exist has a material cause. And if that principle is just as well justified as Craig's causal principle, well, then they stand or fall together.
Yeah, honestly, we can move on to premise number 2 because they just articulated that way better than I was able to. So I am just so grateful to these 3 gentlemen for making this response video and just defending my argument better than I was able to. Thank you. And just to address the argument that Dr. Craig is making here about material causes versus efficient causes, it doesn't actually make any difference. It's not really pertinent to my argument at all. I'm trying to argue that you cannot extrapolate from things that begin to exist from pre-existing material to extrapolate it to things that begin to exist ex nihilo. Whatever your causation, if you're referring to efficient causes or material causes, it doesn't change the nature of the argument I was making. As far as I know, everything I can think of has both an efficient and a material cause. So if we want to have a causal principle of efficient causes or material causes, or both efficient and material causes, it doesn't change the nature of my issue with the first premise. I don't think anything else even needs to be said. We can move on to the second premise.
And here's the next clip. He goes on to premise number 2, gets into the Big Bang.
Now, what about premise 2, right? Premise 2 was that the universe began to exist. Now, on its face of it, a lot of people might have learned about the Big Bang as being the beginning of the universe. But does the Big Bang actually make any such claim? When you get right down to it, most theoretical physicists, astrophysicists, and cosmologists agree that it does not. The Big Bang does not make any claims about where the starting energy of the universe came from. Without that more advanced physics necessary to describe what's going on, you really cannot make any assertive claim about any kind of beginnings. It's only intellectually honest to be agnostic about whether or not our evidence or theories today point to a beginning of the universe. And again, most cosmologists would agree with this.
So is agnosticism about the Big Bang the best option, Bill?
Well, I think that Grayson is simply wrong, that most cosmologists agree that the universe did not begin to exist. I wonder what is his basis for saying that. Why should we believe him in this regard? I noticed that Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, two of the greatest physicists of all time, in their co-authored book, The Nature of Space and Time, published by Princeton University Press, have the following to say, and I quote, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang," end quote. Now, what is especially significant about that quotation is the claim that time itself began at the Big Bang. That means that it is impossible that anything existed prior to the Big Bang. The universe cannot be past eternal. You cannot extend time past the initial state of the universe to infinity past. Now, Grayson would justify his agnosticism by saying that contemporary physics are not yet able to describe that initial state of the universe. In order to do that, we would need to have a marriage of general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and we don't have that yet. We do not have a quantum theory of gravity that would enable us to describe that initial state. But in order to be confident that the universe began to exist, you don't need to be able to describe that initial state of the universe. The great cosmologist Charles Misner once illustrated it in the following way in a conversation with me. He said, "It's as though a tiny window shade were drawn across the first split second of the universe, and we don't know what's going on behind that shade. But we do know that it doesn't come out on the other side." I think that's an apt way of putting it. You don't need to have a physical description of the initial state to know that that initial state was indeed the beginning of the universe.
So this is probably the part in the video that William Lane Craig was referring to where he said I didn't cite the sources for my claims and that he did so much better here by citing his sources. So let's critically examine that, shall we? First of all, I will remedy that. I'll cite some sources here, but every single physicist I've ever spoken to in every physics class I've had has confirmed it is the current scientific consensus that we don't have a theory of quantum gravity and that we don't know whether or not the universe had a beginning until that point. So William Lane Craig here, his source for saying that we don't need a theory of quantum gravity to know that the universe had a beginning, his source for that was a private conversation that this physicist supposedly said to him. And we're just supposed to trust Dr. Craig that he is accurately conveying this person's words. And also we're supposed to trust a private conversation as a scientific legitimate source for Craig's point here. Like, no, I'm sorry, Craig, but a private conversation that you had with a scientist is not a valid supporting citation for your scientific claim. I mean, he wants us to critically think about the sources that are being provided to us on the internet, right? I mean, he's literally just citing a private conversation that he supposedly had that's not documented at all. Okay. Why doesn't this physicist put his positions in writing in the peer-reviewed, published physics journal? That would be a valid thing for you to cite, William Lane Craig. But I'm sure that, the other source that he provides us, that's got to be peer-reviewed, right? That's got to be an actual physics journal. Oh, no, that's a popular science book written in 1996, right? Huh. Oh, and he misattributed it. The quote, he said that it was both Stephen Hawking and Penrose, but that's not true. Everybody knows that Roger Penrose does not believe the universe had a beginning. He doesn't believe that time had a beginning in the Big Bang either. So, it's very well known that Roger Penrose does not accept the premise of the quote that you just attributed to him. So, yeah, sure, this was Stephen Hawking back in 1996. By the way, we hadn't yet developed most of our quantum cosmological models that we have in theoretical physics today that do have mathematically and physically valid past eternal universes as part of those models. Those hadn't been developed yet at the time when the quote was come up, but okay. Also kind of funny that William Lane Craig read everything about the quote except for the year that it's from, right? He even read that it was published by Princeton Publishing, but he neglected to give us the year, which is a very, very crucial component when you're going to be talking about quotes from scientists, right? Because scientific knowledge is provisional. It's subject to change with new information. And we learned a lot of new information in physics in the last 90s, like dark energy, things that made us question our and come up with new theories of quantum cosmology. And the singularity was already being highly doubted in the 90s. Like going back from the 70s, people were getting to doubt the singularity. And by today, in physics, if you are a physics student in the 2020s, virtually nobody believes in the singularity as the beginning of everything. Like, everybody is doubtful of the singularity and figures that whatever is the next advancement in physics, it will get rid of this whole singularity that we have in the Big Bang model. So actually, Craig is completely wrong and off base here. He's quote mining people from the 90s, even though those people's opinions changed. Like, if you asked Roger Penrose now, he would not agree with that quote that Dr. Craig just attributed to him. And for that matter, Stephen Hawking did believe that the universe had a beginning, but his beginning was not in real time. In Stephen Hawking's model, the universe had a beginning in imaginary time, which is time along a different non-real axis. And William Lane Craig explicitly rejects this notion. So he can't really appeal to Stephen Hawking's model. Stephen Hawking has his own interpretation of this model. Other people interpret the same model differently as being past eternal. So there is not a consensus. It's argued back and forth. And Stephen Hawking's model is something that William Lane Craig explicitly rejects in the first place. This is not how scientific citations are done, or a proper way to support your argument. William Lane Craig is trying to make the argument that I was incorrect, and that the consensus of science is actually that the universe itself began at the singularity of the Big Bang. And to support that, the actual citations, the supporting evidence that he brings is a misattributed, outdated quote from a popular science book, not even in peer-reviewed literature. And then his second source is a private conversation that we just have to take his word happened, and that he's accurately conveying that quote to us. This is terrible. This falls so flat of the standard that Dr. Craig set at the end of this podcast episode. I mean, the hypocrisy is blinding. But before anybody accuses me of being a hypocrite and saying, well, Grayson's not providing any citations himself, well, here's what's so amazing about those three individuals that made a response to Dr. Craig's video. One of them, whom we haven't spoken about yet, Phil Halper, runs the Skydive Phil YouTube channel, which is fantastic for science communication and for anyone interested in physics. I mean, Phil has interviewed just about every major living physicist that I can think of. I mean, he really is a legend. His YouTube channel is full of him interviewing the world's leading experts on some of the most interesting topics that I talk about on this channel. So everybody go check out his channel after this. But he was the one that came to my defense on this, because he has actually interviewed these physicists himself, and he just plays clips from what they have said, and it's beautiful, guys. Just watch this. I have to just play this full clip because it's just amazing how hard Craig gets dunked on by some of the world's leading physicists here.
If you want, I can play you lots of cosmologists saying we don't believe, that singularity is real, that we don't, that it basically completely confirms what Grayson says. So it's up to you, Joe, whether you want to play these clips or here's a few things. So let's start with Penrose.
Certainly a view quite commonly expressed now that we shouldn't simply give up that the Big Bang is a singularity, that we need a theory which describes that. Most people would say it's a form of quantum gravity. I have a view which is different from that, but nevertheless, I have in common with that we need a new theory.
The real lesson of the singularity theorems is therefore that we need to combine the general theory of relativity with quantum theory in order to understand the origin of the universe.
What is called the standard Big Bang cosmology, which was a hot Big Bang, right? You start with a very hot, dense universe, and which begins at singularity. So that picture, I don't think anybody believes.
I don't think anybody believes the universe started off with the singularity. That just tells us that Einstein's classical theory of general relativity breaks down. So that classical theory of gravity doesn't apply when you get to very high energies. So it's replaced by some quantum theory, consistent quantum theory of gravity. String theory is a candidate for a theory like this.
Was there a Big Bang?
Okay, I'll stop it there.
Well,
The main comment to make is everyone agrees that it's the singularity theorem that gives you the justification for the beginning of the universe, and the singularity theorem can't be trusted. Now, Hawking was saying, well, I still think there's a beginning, but you have to unpack why does he think that? And I've been in his office and I've interviewed him and I've spoken to his colleagues, and I think the reason is that he interprets the Hartle-Hawking model as still having a beginning, and so he thinks there's still a beginning in quantum cosmology. But what you have to understand is that there's lots of different competing quantum cosmologies, and they don't all say the universe has a beginning. All right. And as we said, the beginning of the Hartle-Hawking model is in imaginary time anyway, which Craig cannot buy into. So, yeah, it's extremely problematic for Craig.
Yeah, and there's currently no expert consensus among cosmologists and physicists about which of those models is the correct one, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. So I just think it's way too premature for Craig to kind of appeal to science. I'm sure, but
yeah, that's right.
Next, Grayson talks about the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Let's go to that clip.
Oftentimes, the Christian apologists will bring up something called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, which is exactly what Frank Turek brought up in the video in which I spoke with him. And in that video, you can see that both Guth and Vilenkin, two of the physicists that came up with that theorem, explicitly clarify that their theorem is talking about inflation. Dr. Craig, does that not count as a citation? I mean, I didn't put the clips of Vilenkin and Guth saying this explicitly in that video, but I did reference a previous video where I did do that. Does that doesn't count as a citation, just directly hearing the words from the scientists who created the theorem themselves? In fact, the clips that I used for that were from Phil Halper's YouTube channel when he interviewed Vilenkin and Guth about the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. And also, thank you, Phil, for correcting the pronunciation on that. I said Borde in the original video. William Lane Craig says Borde in this, but it is Borda. So thanks for the pronunciation. Let's take it over to Phil, and let's actually hear what these scientists told him directly when he interviewed them and asked explicitly, does the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem apply to the universe or just to inflation? Let's hear what the scientists themselves have to say. Shall we, Dr. Craig?
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole, the theorem doesn't say that. It says that the expansion of the universe must have a beginning.
Vilenkin very clearly explains that the theorem is agnostic about the beginning of the universe as a whole. In fact, there's no evidence or reason suggesting that the universe itself had a beginning or has to have a beginning. Based on the currently available evidence that we have today, the only honest position is to say we don't know whether or not the universe had a beginning or not, or if a beginning was even required.
More agnosticism, Bill. Is it warranted?
The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem was indeed originally developed to answer the question whether inflation, that is a super rapid expansion of the universe, could be projected not only into the infinite future, but into the infinite past. And what they discovered was that this is in fact impossible if the universe conforms to a single, very general and plausible condition. But the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem applies not only to inflationary models. That seems to be Grayson's misimpression. Any universe which is on average, in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, has to connect in a finite time to a past boundary. And far from denying the beginning of the universe, Vilenkin is very blunt about its implications. Let me simply read several quotations from him. Quote, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." That's from Vilenkin's book, Many Worlds in One. In 2012, at a conference in Cambridge, celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper which surveyed contemporary cosmology and addressed the question, did the universe have a beginning? And he argued, as I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal." He concluded, quote, "All the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning," end quote. In an article in the online journal Inference, published in the fall of 2015, Vilenkin strengthened that conclusion. Here's what he says in that article, quote, "We have no viable models of an eternal universe. The Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem gives reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed," end quote. So he argues that not only do we have no physically viable models of a past eternal universe, but that his theorem gives reason to believe that such models simply cannot be constructed. Now, what about his colleague Alan Guth? In my debate with the cosmologist Sean Carroll, Carroll tried to quote Guth to the effect that the universe probably didn't begin to exist. And Carroll was bewildered. He said, how could the author of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem deny that the universe had a beginning? Well, the answer to that question was revealed by correspondence between Alan Guth and the philosopher Daniel Kame in England, in which Guth revealed that what he was talking about in that quotation was Sean Carroll's own model of the universe, the so-called Carroll-Chen model. This is a model which features a reversal of time at some point in the past. The arrow of time, instead of running forwards, flips over and runs in the backwards direction. Now, this Carroll-Chen model is not only outrageously non-physical, featuring such a reversal of the arrow of time, but even more fundamentally, it actually implies the beginning of the universe, because those two arrows of time, those two expanding universes, have a common origin point, which represents the beginning of both. Far from representing a past eternal universe, what you have is two expanding universes in different directions in time with a common point of origin. And so it turns out that the model actually implies rather than denies the beginning of the universe.
It's actually rather impressive how much William Lane Craig is lying here and how much he's quote mining physicists to completely change their positions and misconstrue science. So before he further accuses me of not citing my sources, why don't we go back to Phil Halper, who interviewed both Vilenkin and Guth in like 2017, 2018, and asked them specifically this question about, does the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem apply to the universe as a whole or just to inflation or an expanding universe? Here's what the scientists themselves say.
Vilenkin thinks, or he did think, that it proved that the universe had a beginning. When I interviewed him, he'd no longer said that. So that book came out in 2005, and it's a paperback book, right? When I interviewed him in, I think it was 2017 or 2018, I can't remember exactly when. It's just before the pandemic. He said, no, it only proves that inflation had a beginning, doesn't prove the universe had a beginning. I can play the clip if you want. It's up to you, Joe. I've got the clips from Alan Guth and Alex Valenkin both saying that it only proves that inflation has a beginning. What we should also know is that other people have actually disputed this. So recently, maybe I should play this clip. There was a paper in fact, one of the authors on the paper is Paul Davies. And Paul Davies is someone that William Lane Craig has quoted a lot in the past. And they've put a paper out recently saying, actually, the Borda-Guth-Valenkin theorem is flawed. It has a sort of mathematical error in it. And I've got a clip from one of my videos. I can play that. Now, I'm not going to say they're right, because this is not how this works. Because this is what Craig does. And I don't want to make the same mistake as Craig. Some people will come out and makes a claim, or some cosmologist comes out and makes a claim, and he goes, aha, see, right? We've debunked that model because this guy says it's wrong, you know. And I'm not going to say Borda-Guth-Valenkin theorem has been debunked, but it's Borda, pronounced Borda. Okay. So I'm not going to say it's wrong because these guys published a paper saying it was wrong, right? It's a state of flux, right? This is something cosmologists are debating. Maybe, should I play the clip? Here's Guth, actually. You probably should hear it from the horse's mouth. Why not? So here's Guth and Valenkin.
I was working with Arvind Borda and Alex Valenkin to understand what we could
see, pronounced border.
How it might have started and how far back it could have gone. And in particular, once we realized that inflation could be eternal into the future, it seemed like a very natural question to ask. Could inflation have also been eternal into the past?
Also note that it is eternal into the future. It's, you know, infinite number of universes here, which of course Craig thinks is impossible. But anyway.
What we found was that inflation could not be eternal into the past. What we basically managed to achieve was proving a theorem which says that any expanding region of space-time that has a minimum expansion rate can only go back so far and not infinitely far. So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning, but it says that the universe could not have been expanding forever up until the present time.
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole, the theorem doesn't say that. It says that the expansion of the universe must have a beginning.
The theorem says the universe could have not always been expanding. So whether that means there was a beginning, so then beginning out of something else, some other physics maybe, or maybe beginning from a different...
I should just pause it here. This is Ghazal Ghassanjani. She published a paper about the BGB theorem, and PBS Spacetime, the biggest YouTube channel in physics, they just put out a video about this paper. So people should, well, hopefully they'll watch this video because we actually interview her, but they also put a video out, and that's worth watching.
Phase of the universe, which maybe was contracting, maybe it was static. So then we can explore all of these possibilities. I wouldn't a priori rule out any of them.
Theorem, and this is Nihaya Shapshori. He's my co-author. But I think what he has to say is very profound.
Proved by Borda, Guth, and Valenkin suggests that inflation cannot be past eternal, so it must have had a beginning. At least that's the way that they portray it. But what really it is about is there's a trajectory of a particle, if you look at it, it goes back into the past, and what this particle experiences. Now, the question is, does that actually tell us anything about the universe as we know it? Now, particles, as we know, don't actually make up the universe now. So the universe, the quantum universe, is not made out of particles, they're made out of fields. So particles are only an approximation in certain limit. But especially when you go to early times, when things become more quantum, the notion of particle becomes less and less defined. But what does it tell us about our universe? If our universe is not made out of particles, but made out of quantum fields, and it's not necessarily classical geometry, but a quantum geometry. So these are all assumptions that we know are going to break down at early times, and we know fundamentally cannot be correct in a quantum theory of gravity or quantum theory of...
Okay, hang on. Let me just skip to... yeah, this is the new paper. Here we go.
I wrote this paper with my student, Joe Lesnevsky and Paul Davies, where we highlighted that there is an ambiguity in the way that one defines the average expansion rate of the universe in the BGV theorem. And depending on how one defines this, one can get different answers. And because of this, we found that it is, in fact, possible to find solutions which, in general, are inflating eternally into the past and into the future. This is a controversial point somewhat, but mathematicians would say that they used an inappropriate definition for geodesic completeness.
Okay, so all right, you get the idea, right? Now, again, I don't want to say these guys are right. Yeah. Maybe someone's going to find a flaw in their paper, but this is what happens in physics. It's back and forth, and the conclusion is still up in the air. That's the point, right? And he can quote, some people, Vilenkin, as saying, Vilenkin thinks the universe had a beginning. He does, right? But I just thought, can I get a dozen cosmologists, like off the top of my head, who think that it might not have a beginning? So I just very quickly, in like a minute, I went, Alan Guth, Roger Penrose, Don Page, Leonard Susskind, Gabriela Veneziano, Abe Ashtekar, Yasunori Nomura, Anthony Aguirre, Sean Carroll, Paul Steinhardt, Robert Brandenberger. There you go. There's a dozen cosmologists that think the universe may not have a beginning. Are they right? I don't know, right? But you can't, what kind of philosophical argument is this? One guy says that the universe has a beginning, so it has a beginning. Is that what, I thought philosophers were really very impressive logical arguments. Yeah. He's basically just saying one person in a debate has this view and I'm going to quote them. That's just pure cherry picking.
Anyone who has their ear on the ground in physics and understands what it is that physicists are interested in and what they're currently working on knows that there is no beginningless cosmological model that is probable, and likewise, there's no cosmological model with a beginning that's probable. No cosmological model is probable. And so it shouldn't be that the whole discussion shouldn't be about whether or not we have any specific cosmological model that's probable. We already know that there isn't one.
Challenge for Craig. Tell us which cosmological model you think is probable. Right. Of the very early universe, right?
Yeah,
not
right.
About, expansion from a hot dense state, but, something that happened, maybe before inflation, if inflation happened.
Okay, so I think that it should be clear now to everyone listening who was lying about the science. I mean, we're hearing it straight up from the physicists who created the theorem that are saying that the way that William Lane Craig is using the theorem is not what the theorem says. You cannot use the BGV theorem to say that the universe had a beginning. That is Craig's argument. That means he's misusing science and trying to say that science is making claims it doesn't say. And to make things worse, he's trying to pass himself off as an expert whose opinion has authority. And he's trying to say that his opinion on this, his claims, are supported by the scientists. And he's quote mining these scientists to try to create straw men of their position to make it sound like they are agreeing with Craig, when in reality, Craig disagrees with these scientists, and these scientists are saying the opposite of what he's trying to claim they're saying. This is just dishonest, and Craig should know enough to know he's being dishonest about this. I mean, this has to be... You cannot quote mine this much unintentionally. He has to be intentionally misrepresenting these physicists here just to make his point, because he cannot give up the Kalam premises.
In my responses today, I was careful to give documentation to Vilenkin's and Hawking and Penrose's statements that our viewers can check out for themselves.
Craig thinks that if you can provide a quote from a book written 20 or 30 years ago, that is somehow offering scientifically credible support for his arguments. I'm sorry, Craig, that's not how science works. If you're going to cite anything, it should be a peer-reviewed study or a lit review or something that is published in an actual academic journal. That you shouldn't be quoting pop sci books, conversations that you've had in private, or whatever else. You need to cite actual scientific publications for your sources, or cite the scientists directly with an up-to-date quote about what they currently believe today, not what they believed 30 years ago. Scientists change their mind when they're presented with new data or new theoretical models. That's what happened with Roger Penrose. That's what happened with Vilenkin. That's what happened with Guth. When new data comes to light, scientists change their mind. But this new data has come to light. It did in the 90s. And William Lane Craig still has not changed his mind. That's the problem. He's still clinging to the second premise and pretending that it has a scientific consensus to back it. But that's just a lie. It doesn't. The scientific consensus is one of agnosticism for the beginning of the universe. Hopefully, Craig can accept as scientific support the over a dozen PhD scientists and philosophers of science who I have shown in this video that are clearly supporting my position that there is no consensus in science about whether the universe had a beginning or not, and Craig is clearly wrong about that and lying about both the science and the scientists to try to save face and trick his audience into thinking that he's right. So let's just close out this video by listening to the end of William Lane Craig's thoughts about my video when I present the entire new fixed kalam to him. Let's summarize. Premise number 1. All things that begin to exist are created from other previously existing things. Premise 2. The universe may have begun to exist, although we can't know for sure. The conclusion that logically follows from these premises is the universe may have been created from other previously existing things, although we cannot know for sure. Isn't it strange how when you update the premises of the Kalam cosmological argument to more accurately reflect the most current up-to-date understandings of science and philosophy, all of a sudden the conclusion is quite sensible indeed. I don't think anybody would take any issues with such a conclusion in the fields of science or philosophy. It's no small wonder that the Christians don't want to go anywhere near it, because all of a sudden it's going to be pretty tough to figure out a way to smuggle your God into that conclusion.
Well, what about his fixed version, Bill? And by the way, I noticed that he calls any further analysis smuggling this time.
Yeah. I was really surprised by this reformulation because he hasn't said anything to justify his reformulated premise 1.
Really, Bill? I didn't say anything to justify my changing of the first premise? Not even when I appealed to every known instance of any process or thing ever happening in every instance of the known universe? Like, every single empirically verifiable thing that exists was created from previously existing material. Straight up. Like, I don't know what you want me to cite for that. It's literally everything in the known universe. Like, there is not a single example I am aware of anything being created from nothing, without a material cause. So, I don't know exactly what you want me to cite for that. Why don't you cite a counter example? And he is going to do that. But before I address his counterexamples, because I think that they're quite philosophically interesting, and ironically, there's not a philosophical consensus about the examples that Bill is about to offer. But before I let him do that, I just have to clarify one thing, because I thought that Bill started out this reaction video by saying that there was nothing new about my arguments, that everything I had said he'd seen before. But now, all of a sudden, he says he's shocked. Maybe you guys can cite the sources of somebody who's fixed the Kalam instead of just criticized it, because I think that that is actually a fairly novel angle to approach this with. That's why I thought it would make for an interesting video in the first place, is because I wasn't just criticizing the Kalam. It wasn't just a video of my criticisms of the Kalam. It was a video where I fixed the premises and I updated the conclusion, and I haven't seen anybody else do that. That does seem to me to be new and unique and, you know, in my opinion, interesting. So I think it's weird that Bill, his very first criticism of my video is that it's all tried and before, he's heard it all before. No new arguments, nothing new. But then here, when we get to my conclusion, all of a sudden he's saying that he's shocked. It's like, what is it? Are you bored because there's nothing new? Or are you shocked because you've never seen somebody rephrase the kalam this way? What is it, Bill?
His reformulated premise says everything that begins to exist has a material cause. And he hasn't given any reason to think that that's true. There's no conceptual reason to think that something cannot have an efficient cause, but no material cause.
Yeah, the only thing to support such a claim would be every empirical observation that's ever been made of anything that's measurable.
He hasn't given any reason to think that that's true. There's no conceptual reason to think that something cannot have an efficient cause, but no material cause. And in fact, I think we can even give some examples of things that have efficient causes that don't have material causes. For example, abstract objects like works of art or musical compositions or the equator are objects that plausibly have causes. They're composers and artists that produce them, or the planet Earth that comes to form causes an equator to exist by its spherical shape. But there are no material causes of these entities. So even if they have efficient causes, there is no material cause. So he simply hasn't justified his first reformulated premise. There's no reason to think that in the case of the universe, that the universe does have a material cause. In fact, the evidence is quite the contrary, that all matter and energy, space and time themselves, came into being at the moment of the Big Bang. And therefore, the universe, while plausibly having an efficient cause, does not and cannot have a material cause.
So, as we've already seen, Craig is just lying about the scientific consensus on that point about premise number 2. But I am actually somewhat intrigued that he would think that he could offer examples of objects that have an efficient cause but no material cause, because every single example is just easily debunked. Like, the material cause for a work of art is obviously the material that was used to construct it and the material in the person's mind when they came up with the idea. Like, the same with music, right? When you compose music, generally you write it down on a piece of paper or a computer or something. That's a material cause. It's like, this is not abstract objects. Like, art and music are not abstract objects. They have a physical medium that has a material cause. And in the brain, when you come up with an idea for a song and it's in your head, that still has a material substance to it. There's actual physical molecules in your brain that are moving in such a way that create that thought of that song in your head. There's a physical material cause and basis for everything that William Lane Craig came up with. What was the other one? The equator? Like, the equator is not an object that exists, my guy. It's not like the equator's floating out there in the universe. The equator is a concept, and concepts exist in people's brains. Physically. Like, there are, again, physical molecules moving around in your head when you conceive of an equator. Like, there's a specific memory or connotations which corresponds to actual neural correlates, that actual physical movement of molecules going on. Like, these are not abstract objects that do not exist physically. Every single thing he just mentioned has both an efficient and a material cause. In fact, this line of reasoning actually hurts Craig more than it helps him, because, like, my point is that everything that I'm aware of has both a material and an efficient cause. So I didn't think it was necessary to particularly stipulate which one I'm referring to in the first premise, because it doesn't really matter. You could be referring to only the efficient, only the material cause, or both, and it doesn't change my premise. But if he wants to get specific and he wants to start saying, oh, well, you can have efficient cause but not a material cause, it works the other way too, buddy. And actually, there's a lot of literature out there, and big shout out to, again, Dr. Dan Linford for bringing this to my attention in their video, but there's actually a lot of literature out there with well-known examples that are often talked about in the field of philosophy of physics about things that have a material cause but not an efficient cause. So literally the exact opposite of what Craig relies on for his argument. The examples that Dr. Linford brought up of people in the philosophical literature making the argument is that white dwarfs, a type of star that has a material cause, it has material that it was made from, but its actual efficient cause is argued to be non-existent because it's just a result of the sort of previous conditions of that material. So it's a very interesting argument. I'm not sure if I buy it 100%, to be honest. I mean, the other example that was brought up was covalent bonds, and philosophers that have made arguments that covalent bonds have a material cause but not an efficient cause. And I think it's an interesting argument. I would definitely want to read more about it. I don't buy into it yet, but the point I'm making is that even in Craig's own field, or in the field of philosophy of physics or science in general, there's still controversy over if something can have a material cause without an efficient cause, or an efficient cause without a material cause, and there's not a consensus about that. In this video response, Craig is trying to pass off his opinions as the authoritative position to have, and he's pretending like he has all of this scientific and philosophical support for his claims, while simultaneously saying that you should be skeptical about people that are offering their claims on the internet and you should be deeply critical about their sources. Well, that's what I did in this video, Dr. Craig, and your sources critically failed inspection. Your sources did not support what you were saying. Your claims did not check out and were in direct contradiction with the consensus of scientists and philosophers. So really, the pot's calling the kettle black. The call is coming from inside Dr. Craig's house. Hopefully, he accepts all of the supporting evidence that I cited in this video, since that, he claims, was his main problem with my last video, and hopefully he is able to change his mind. I know it's been a long time. I know that he's built his career off of the Kalam argument, but it's time, Dr. Craig. The evidence might have been ambiguous enough back in the 70s to where you could try to use science to dress up your arguments, but we're in the 2020s now, and the science has moved beyond you, and you should be mature enough and open-minded enough to be able to look at the evidence, look at the actual field, the physics community, and realize that. And then change your arguments. Change the things you're saying to more accurately reflect the current state of the evidence and the current state of the science. Instead, what you did in this video, and what you do generally, is lie about that science. And that's not cool. That's not okay. You should really stop doing that, because this video, Majesty of Reason's video, Dr. Dan Linford's work, Phil Halper's work over on his YouTube channel, like, there are a ton of people who have debunked this argument. It is a tired argument, and every objection to it has been heard, because those objections are valid. So instead of just dismissing every criticism as just old hat, you've heard it all before, why don't you just approach the state of the evidence with an open mind and go where it leads? That's all I'm asking. I think it's very unlikely that Dr. Craig is going to watch this response video, but he watched the first one, so you never know. It could happen. Dr. Craig, if you made it this far into the video, I appreciate you watching. Honestly, this would probably be a hard video for you to watch. I mean, it's challenging a lot of deeply held positions of yours. So thank you for watching. I hope that you can make a response that actually addresses my arguments. Not a straw man, not a bunch of quote mined clips from some co-host that, like, you employed. So honestly, you should hire better personnel if you're gonna be reacting to a clip that is misrepresenting the original video. But whatever, neither here nor there. If you respond, I'm gonna give you the same advice that you gave me. You told me to take my time, really listen to all the arguments, do your background research, and actually have supporting evidence that backs up your claims. I'm going to hold you to that same standard, Dr. Craig, and if you make a response video, I hope that you will hold yourself to that same standard as well, because clearly in this video, you did not. You simply lied and misrepresented actual scientists and experts in the field, which is unacceptable. And maybe also watch my video about you and the Canaanite genocide and maybe have a good hard long look in the mirror about what kind of person can justify the genocide of children and infants and still consider them to be so righteous as you. So that's all. That's my final advice. If you got this far in the video and you enjoyed it, please like it and subscribe for more. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, keep curious and stay learning.
In my responses today, I was careful to give documentation to Vilenkin's and Hawking and Penrose's statements that our viewers can check out for themselves. And so I would encourage people, when you listen to these popularizers, don't be gullible. Don't think that they're authorities on this matter. Ask for the documentation that supports their assertions before you buy into them too quickly.